From KPFK in Los Angeles, California, Valley Free Radio in Florence, Massachusetts, WNUC in Detroit, and BikeTalk.org worldwide, this is Bike Talk.
Bike Talk.
Welcome to Bike Talk. I'm Taylor Nichols.
And I'm Nick Richard.
Hey, Nick. You know, we've been talking about how Los Angeles is or is not preparing for the 2028 Summer Olympics. I read in the New York Times that in Italy, they're having some trouble, that the Olympic Village ran out of condoms. And I can assure you, for the Summer Olympics in 28, Los Angeles may not have their streets prepared and may not have a lot of active transportation routes for visitors and athletes alike. But we will have enough condoms for the athletes in the Olympic Village.
That's very reassuring, Taylor. We are moving forward with our stickers for reviews program. We got a kind of a request on Blue Sky.
Natifa van Suker. And if we butchered that, please let us know.
I'm sure we did. Hey, biketalk.bsky.social. Is there a way to directly purchase some stickers? I think one might look good on my insulated drink container and maybe my laptop. And I responded, we'll send you 2 big and 2 little stickers for a pic of your Bike Talk review on Apple or Spotify.
Great. I'd love a pic of the sticker on their bike.
Does a big one go on a bike or is it too big? Does it go in a car?
It could go in a car. It's not so big as like a bumper sticker. It's, what is it, 3x3, something like that? Inches.
It's nice on a car because it's ironic.
Yeah, totally. We also got another listener email from Desmond. He was talking a little bit about our panel that we did on winter riding. He says, I was surprised that none of your winter guests, who were great, by the way, mentioned pogies. And then he goes on to say, pogies are a sort of outer mitt that attaches to your handlebars. They can be soft and flexible or a bit more structured, neoprene, for instance. In either case, they're magic at cutting the wind and allowing you to wear thinner, more nimble gloves or mitts underneath, or even bare hands, so you can do your biking things with more dexterity and comfort. I fully agree with the consensus of your panel that you can winter bike in just whatever clothes you have, but pogies really are that great one piece of niche gear that makes a big difference. My wife even made a pair out of used Amazon bubble envelopes and sheeting tape.
Cool.
Love the show. Please consider continuing to feature Canadian content and items from north of the border. Thanks, Des.
Desmond must be from Canada.
Eh?
We'll always feature Canada when we can. Love Canada. Thanks for standing up to us.
Yeah.
So yeah, we're going to talk more about winter riding this episode later with the head of the Boston Bike Union. But for right now, there's good news and bad news out of your town, Taylor.
Yeah, in Los Angeles, there's been a project on the books for a while, Sunset for All, which is a section of Sunset Boulevard where they are going to try to make it more of a pedestrianized, friendly area to bike and walk. It's taken a long time and a lot of outreach, but DOT is now officially recognizing Sunset for All as part of their plan. So that's the good news. Go ahead. You want to read the bad news?
The bad news is City Council's apparently throwing away active transportation grant money for projects in Wilmington, Skid Row, and Boyle Heights because they couldn't get them built.
Right.
So for more on that, here is Michael Schneider, founder of Streets for All.
Hey, Michael.
Hey, Taylor. How's it going?
Good. So tell us what's going on. We're throwing away good money. Is that it?
Oh, man. After spending hundreds of hours on grant applications and being very successful in winning $103 million in 2022, the city apparently is poised to give all that money back because we can't get projects built in a time frame that's acceptable to the California Transportation Commission. And it's likely going to result in the CTC redlining LA and us not getting future active transportation money for a while, because they're just going to give it to cities that their applications might not be as good, but they get the stuff built.
$103 million?
For 3 projects, $39 million for a project on Skid Row, the Skid Row Connectivity and Safety Project, $32 million for the Boyle Heights Connectivity Project, and $32 million for the Wilmington Safe Streets Project.
Is it too much public outreach? Is it a city council person? How did this happen?
DOT and frankly, most Department of Transportations work at a pace like we're never going to die. And there's not a real sense of urgency around the projects. I mean, to me, this is totally inexcusable. It's incompetence. It makes LA look ridiculous. Clearly, these projects weren't prioritized in a way that they could be delivered in whatever timing the grant came with. But again, this is already 4 years ago. We won the money.
Right.
Well, we applied in 2022. We won the money in 2023. So they've had 2.5, close to 3 years to do something.
And if it punishes Los Angeles in the future by being redlined and not getting these kind of grants, that's a real problem also, I think.
Yeah, Taylor, I was on a call with the CTC last year, and I was advocating for more active transportation money in the state in general with a big group. And somebody from the CTC staff said, "Oh, you're from LA?" I said, "Yeah." "Well, you really should," they didn't put it this way, I'll paraphrase, "have your city get its shit in order because we keep giving money to the city and they don't get anything built. And they keep asking us for endless extensions. And we're getting really tired of it." So
Yeah.
this motion is sort of the conclusion of a long tortured process where the city thinks they can just keep asking for more time and not prioritize anything. It's also a function of our budget and our city agencies that are tasked with delivering these projects not having enough staff and enough internal resources to actually do it, because the grant money doesn't pay for staff time. And that's probably
Right.
the biggest thing people should understand. DOT, Bureau of Engineering and Streets LA, the three divisions of the city government that actually deliver these projects, have to spend their own money on their own staff to spend the free money. And if they don't have enough staff, stuff like this happens.
Wow. Well, it's really, again, disheartening that we talk about this all the time. How do we make the streets safer? And then when we finally get the money to do that, the money slips through our fingers.
It's so frustrating. You and I both have been in this fight for a long time. We know how
Yeah.
hard it is to get precious dollars towards this stuff, especially right now in a very broke city. And so to be giving back over $100 million to the state in money we already spent a lot of money and
Right.
time winning. Those weren't free hours, those hundreds of
Right.
hours on the grant applications. Only to
Right.
give the money back is just tragic.
Michael Schneider, Streets for All. Thanks for getting the money, helping getting the money in the first place. And thanks for making us aware that we're losing the money. So hopefully it doesn't happen again.
Thanks, Taylor. Good to see you.
Wow. We've been talking lately about the killing of Alex Preddy and all of the demonstrations and protests around that. And a bike is a great thing to have at a protest. It's a great way to get to the protest, a great way to get out of the protest. But what happens if you're riding your bike and the police or even ICE try to stop you and you're not at a protest? You're just riding home at night. You didn't blow through a stop sign. You're not weaving. Doesn't look like you're drunk on the bike. You've got your mandated lights and things like that. And a cop pulls up to you and says, "Hey, come here. Let me see your ID." What do you do? So Jim Pokras is here to tell us what to do. Jim Pokras from Pokras and De Los Reyes. What do we do?
Cyclists have the same rights and are subject to the same provisions as a driver of a motor vehicle. You have to stop at stop signs or traffic signals and things like that. But it
Right.
also means that you're protected under the Fourth Amendment, the right of search and seizure. You have the same protections against being detained without legal justification. So when you ask the question, do the police, can they just stop you for no reason? The answer is absolutely no, they can't. But they do that all the time. So when can they do that? If they have reasonable cause, for a reasonable suspicion that somebody is actually breaking a law. And if the bike doesn't have a light on it or they're rolling through a stop sign, they have the right to stop people. But the question that you're asking is if you're on your way to, a protest and a policeman casually, comes up and says, "Hey, can I talk to you?" Are they allowed to do that? And the answer is they have the right to do that, but you also have the right to, not talk to them and leave. You have a constitutional right not to conform to, what they want to do. If they want to go through your backpack or they want to go through your pockets or something like that, you just say no.
If they just say, "Hey, I want to ask you a question," I, on my bike, can stop and answer the question. And then if they start prying to know more information, I can say to them, "Am I being detained or am I free to go?" They have to say, "You're free to go," but I don't have to answer whatever probing questions they might be asking beyond, "Did you see someone break into that house down the street?" or something like that. I want to assume that police are trying to do the right thing. And so they stop me to get information about something else. And then it turns awkward or dangerous.
It could turn ugly really fast when the cyclist who's stopped either starts giving some attitude or starts arguing with a police officer that asks them to, give me your name and identify yourself or something like that. California is not a stop and identify state. Okay, you don't have to have ID on you. But if the police officer pulls you over and asks you for your name and identifying information, you are required to give that to them. You don't have to produce physical ID, and you don't have to have some kind of an interrogation. You can identify yourself, but you don't have to give them your life story. Okay. And that's where it starts to get bad, because somebody will say, I'm not going to give you my name. You're harassing me or something like that. And your goal isn't to, win an argument with the police officer. The goal is to go home safely and to get away from the situation. So how do you do that? That's the real question.
If the police says stop on the bike, what's your name? I do have to stop my bike and say my name is Taylor Nichols, but then I can say, am I being detained or am I free to go? And if they keep asking questions, then I can leave. Am I getting that right?
That's exactly right. Am I being detained or am I free to go? Those are like the key words that somebody should have in their mind. Because if they are not being detained, then you're free to go. But if you are being detained, the police officer has to tell you that you're being detained because, you didn't have a front light, or you look like somebody that just, robbed somebody down the street. I need to get some information. Stay calm, make no sudden movements, keep your hands, visible. And again, the magic language that we just said, I want to repeat it again. Am I being detained or am I free to go? If free to go, leave. If you're being detained, don't argue roadside with them. Provide the information that's required. Do not physically, resist and clearly decline searches. If they ask you to search, don't consent to any searches. That is a major thing. If you agree to a search, you've waived your Fourth Amendment rights of search and seizure. They have to have probable cause to be able to search. But if you come back and they go, can I look in your backpack? And you go, yeah, you've waived your Fourth Amendment rights. Don't escalate the situation, with your ego and start saying, you can't do this, and start fighting with the police officer.
That's a big one, because I can see how you might get defensive against some prying cop and it can get out of hand very quickly.
Exactly right. For the third time, I'll repeat, the goal isn't to win the argument. The goal is to go home safely. Comply as much as you can without waiving your Fourth Amendment right. Again, they cannot stop you just because they want to, stop you.
Jim Pocras of Pocras and De Los Reyes, thanks again.
Thank you for having me, and everybody be safe out there. And if you do get stopped, just stay calm and try to get by the situation.
That's great advice. Thanks, Jim. Well, that was Jim Pocras of Pocras and De Los Reyes. And I think the real takeaway from that, Nick, was traffic codes change, but the constitutional process does not. Whether you're on a bike or in a car or at a protest or just riding home late at night. So
there is a thing called the Fourth Amendment.
We've been talking a lot about winter biking, of course, and it's been on everybody's mind because it is February. In Boston, they've been having some trouble getting those bike lanes cleared of the snow, which really surprises me because the mayor of Boston, Michelle Wu, I thought was a team player. We have Tiffany Cogell here from the Boston Cyclists Union. Tiffany, welcome to Bike Talk.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
What's going on in Boston? Do you have a lot of snow, and are the bike lanes being cleared or just the car lanes?
So we received multiple snowstorms and multiple inches of snow. We are in New England, and we are used to, nor'easters and cumulative snow, but we haven't had this much snow in such a short period of time. In a lot of years, the streets are inundated and quite narrow, as well as the sidewalks, because there really is just no place to put the snow. The snow has been plowed. It has not been removed.
And have the bike lanes been plowed? And are there good protected bike lanes?
A few weeks ago, we came up with a day of action that was really to address the fact that the bike lanes have mostly not been cleared. Right. And the streets have been insufficiently cleared, and the sidewalks are woeful, honestly. We even have some disability advocates who use mobility devices themselves who are not able to even get outside onto their sidewalk. So this is truly an issue of mobility justice. we decided to get out onto Calm Ave and free up some of those bike lanes from the snow. And we know in the Allston Brighton area of Boston, so many people use bikes as a mode of transportation. And so there's two options. You can either ride out in the street or you can ride on the sidewalk. And neither one of those options are safe for, obvious reasons. And
Right.
we're really concerned that the folks who have chose to continue using bikes as transportation are in danger. It's not as secure as it should be.
Is this a failure of leadership, do you think? Or is it just really so much snow this time around that they just can't handle it? Or is this kind of an ongoing thing where Boston often doesn't take care of its cyclists?
Well, for whatever reason, cycling, being a cyclist, what does it mean to be a cyclist? And bike lanes have become so politicized and just so controversial over the past few years, particularly over the last election season. And there are a lot of theories for why that is, but what that really comes down to is an issue of equity. If we're arguing about desirability or the right to travel safely, regardless of the mode that you choose, what we're really saying is we're okay with some people having more access to, transportation to be able to get around freely and safely than others. And if that's what we're saying, what does that mean? And how does that impact the constituents that in a large way supported this mayor because of her bike-friendly policies?
Well, it sounds like your answer a little bit was a failure of leadership. And that's why the Boston Cyclists Union is important. And that's why I'm really glad you came on the show, Tiffany, to sort of explain to us what's going on in Boston. I'm glad you guys were able to get out there and have a day of action and clear some of those bike lanes. And now maybe the city will see that that is a reasonable way to spend their time and money.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Tiffany Cogell of the Boston Cyclists Union. Nick, when we turned off the recording, she was saying how it really is a failure of many people, of many institutions altogether, along with a pretty heavy snowfall. The fault doesn't lie with one person, but with many.
Okay. Charlie.
Charlie's news.
Hey, it's Charlie here with the week's news from Streets Blog Mass. A project in Newton, Massachusetts, which gave a road diet to Washington Street, has decreased traffic and speeding while increasing bicycle use in its new two-way protected shared use path, according to detailed traffic analysis. Amazingly, the data did not seem to show increased traffic in the surrounding neighborhoods, nor in a major expected diversion route. From the Bicycle Coalition of Greater Philly, PennDot is set to invest $17 million for safety improvement projects in southeast Pennsylvania. $1 million of this funding will include signage for a recent law which prohibits vehicles stopping in bike lanes citywide, along with signs for loading zones and no right turn on red signs. From WABE in Atlanta, that eBike rebate program, Reboot, that I mentioned a few weeks ago, is officially getting the green light. $1 million will go towards making e-bikes more affordable to Atlantans. Finally, from the New York Times, Mayor Zohran Mamdani has announced a slew of projects that are being revived after they were shut down by the Adams administration. Among the plans are improved bus lanes in the Bronx and protected bike lanes in Brooklyn.
Thanks, Charlie. Now we have a volunteer and friend of the show, Zohran Martinez, who interviews Peter Norton, who's the author of Fighting Traffic, Street Rivals, and Autonorama.
And Peter's been on the show a couple of times. He's got a great voice in this fight.
I'm thrilled to be joined by one of the most insightful and thought-provoking people in the transportation field, Peter D. Norton, an associate professor in the Department of Engineering and Society at the University of Virginia. Welcome to Bike Talk.
Zohran, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for that very generous intro.
Thank you. I mentioned when I reached out to you that I'm a big fan of your work, and I remember when your first book, Fighting Traffic, The Dawn of the Motor Age in the American City, was published, and it was making the rounds on Streets Blog in the early days of Twitter, kind of like 2011, 2012. And it honestly feels like every other year someone discovers your work or parts of it go viral to new audiences. For the slice of listeners who may not be familiar with your work or need a refresher, I'm curious how you would summarize it, but my take is your book, Fighting Traffic, documents how streets and public spaces that predate cars and were dominated by pedestrians and public transit, shifted to become car-dominated spaces, and that the shift wasn't inevitable, but reflected some successful lobbying and marketing from people with a financial stake and in mass adoption of cars to change how the public and decision makers interpreted streets and how they should be used and their attitudes about them. Do you feel that's a fair summary?
That is a very nice summary. If I were to add anything at all, it's just that I came to the subject with questions about why the status quo is so oppressive to everybody who's not in a car, to the point that people who are in a car are not in it by choice. They're in it, many of them at least, by necessity. I drive too, and when I drive, it's not by choice. And I wanted to know how, in a society that says it celebrates individuality and freedom of choice, we have only the least efficient, most expensive, most energy intensive, most dangerous choice, and it's not even a choice at all. I just wanted to know why.
Yeah, and I think that touches on something that a lot of us take for granted. Myself, I grew up partially here in Los Angeles, but I also grew up partially in Malmo, Sweden, and these are two very different places, and yet I never thought to question the two settings when I was in the respective city. And I think your work and the work of Donald Shoup, they ask these incredibly thought-provoking questions about matters that nobody really had previously thought about. If we try to make things a little more explicit, I don't know if you feel you could summarize the top three takeaways from your book, Fighting Traffic.
One of them is that the status quo, which is very car-dominated, even in big cities like Los Angeles, is not the product of American culture, although you often hear this, or of consumer choice, or mass demand, or democracy, or technological progress. That's a short list of some of the most common explanations, and I think the historical records shows that none of them is a satisfactory explanation of car-dominated cities and towns and suburbs. So that's one. Another is that, let's see, I'm thinking of a short list of three. A second one I would offer is that this is not simply a competition between, let's say, automobiles versus streetcars. There was a period, especially from the 70s to the 90s, where that competition was very much the subject of attention, and people were either on the side of the cars or on the side of the streetcars. And I find that binary distinction not very useful as an explanatory approach. It was more complicated than that. And finally, I would say the transformation is attributable, the transformation that gave us car-dominated cities is attributable really to three lesser transformations that made that possible. One was a transformation of social norms. You know, how should we get around in a city? Another was a transformation in laws. What are the rules that govern the way we can get around the city? And the third is a transformation of engineering standards. So engineering standards that had once favored efficiency, therefore discouraged driving. So that those had to be transformed such that driving became a normal and approved and favored way of getting around a city before the city could become a car-dominated city.
Yeah, I think those are great ways to summarize it. And I think to the general public, or, you know, whenever your work does go viral, I would say your book is probably most famous for kind of telling the story of the invention of jaywalking. That is what a lot of people probably know it for, right?
Yeah, I feel sometimes a little bit like that actor who was in a TV series and then can't get another role because they're known for that TV series. So, and I'm not complaining. I'm just making that observation because there is a certain pattern where the press, to my surprise, picked up the jaywalking angle first. That was partly my fault because I did single that out for attention in an article as well. And that was the consistent go-to story. Oh, he's the guy who can tell us about jaywalking. And I'm happy to do that because to me, it's a perfect illustration of how the social norms component was pursued. In other words, you couldn't have car domination as long as everybody thought it was just fine to stroll out into the street wherever they wanted, which is what people were doing. And the law was on their side, judges were on their side, juries were on their side, newspaper editors were on their side. So to shift that social norm such that car domination could happen, took some really ingenious and effortful and elaborate campaigns intended to deter walking. And one way you deter it is by ridiculing disapproved walking, and jaywalker was a good term of ridicule for that purpose.
Yeah, and I know you've told that story many times, so I think that we can stop there. But you aren't just a one-note person, because you have also written a second book, Autonorama, The Illusory Promise of High-Tech Driving. And this book chronicles how, since roughly the 1930s, the car industry has repeatedly tried selling us a future of mass driving that is off in the not too distant future, that will be safer and made possible by the latest and greatest in technology. And they have done this, as you document in your book, roughly every 25 years for the past century. So what are the consequences of this if the vision has never been achieved? It kind of seems like no harm, no foul.
Right. So the vision not only cannot be achieved, and I'm talking about a vision of a future where everyone drives anywhere at any time without crashes and without delay, and parks for free when they get to their destination. That is the fantasy that has been sold for 90 plus years. Now, not only is that vision impossible to achieve, or another way of putting it is, if you did achieve it, you'd have to destroy the whole city and ruinate the planet. But not only is the vision never achieved, but a lot of waste is produced along the way. And most of all, if you know what opportunity cost is, well, what happens is the opportunity to pursue things that do work, like walkability, like biking, like transit, all interrelated as a whole system, we lose that. And when you lose that, you not only fail to get the vision that's sold to you, but you actually get a city that is hostile to people and wasteful and energy intensive and unaffordable. So yeah, that's the technique reminds me, probably most of us in our life have had experience with a person who needed to borrow a few bucks, was not reliable about paying it back, but would come back to us repeatedly. And such a person learns not to just say, hey, I need 50 bucks. They learn, after their trust has been depleted, to say, and I will pay you back in 3 weeks exactly. And this is what begins to give it, well, they have a plan, or I will pay you back because I have a paycheck coming on the 1st. And it's those statements that can recover lost credibility. Well, we are on a much larger scale dealing with the same kind of promise making and promise breaking. The difference, I think the decisive difference, is we don't have a collective memory the way we have an individual memory, such that we have forgotten that that promise was made to us 25 years ago, it was made to us 50 years ago, it was made to us 75 years ago, and it was made to us 100 years ago. And we are still falling for it because of those short memories, which, is why George Santayana said, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. We're repeating that mistake. And so as a historian, I think of one of my jobs as repairing that memory.
With that context in mind, and the work you've done in both your books, I wanted to ask you a little bit about an article you wrote last month called "A Warning to Canada, Self-Driving Taxis Won't Be a Cure-All, Traffic Cure-All, and They Ignore the Real Disease." Now, I've read the article, but what is the warning for those listeners that have not had a chance to read it yet?
So you're talking about an op-ed that was published in the Globe and Mail, a national newspaper based in Toronto, widely read in Canada. First thing I want to say about this is that the editor chose the article title, and I was really not happy with that. It's fine, I don't object, but the reason I'm not happy with it is that right now, I don't think Canadians want to hear any American giving them a warning, because the U.S. administration has been insulting Canada constantly in the most absurd and offensive and boorish ways. And so I'd like to say I'm not happy with the editor saying a warning to Canada. All right, with that behind us, this article is a caution related to the book Autonorama, in that right now, automakers, tech companies, robotaxi companies, including Waymo, are promising a future where high tech makes cars finally work well in cities. And I'm not here to say, well, you shouldn't have any Waymos ever in any city or can't have any robo-taxis ever in any city. I think that's something cities can decide for themselves and so on. But I do think we need to be very careful that nobody follow along with the promise that robo-taxis are going to make city transportation work even where public transportation is neglected. In Toronto specifically, they have a problem where they've got a good streetcar network, and yet it is stuck in traffic. The solution in such a situation is not to put more cars on the road that may actually attract some streetcar riders who can afford it onto the Waymos. The solution is to get the public transportation working very well first, and then let's talk about Waymos afterward. I think it's a question of priorities.
Yeah, and I thank you for adding that note about the title, because I did notice that the article refers to self-driving taxis, but throughout the article, you refer to the term robo-taxis. And I know you're critical of language because you've said in the past you don't like the phrase data-driven because data doesn't make decisions. People need to decide what policies and values are important or even worth measuring. You've also been critical of the term autonomous vehicle because a truly autonomous vehicle would drive wherever it wants and not care where the passenger wants to go. Is robo-taxi the right term for these vehicles that you're referring to?
Of all the terms that are currently being used for these vehicles, I think robo-taxi is the best. One is there's no pretense that this is something other than a taxi. Sometimes, we did hear for a while about shared mobility or share vehicles, and sometimes the word sharing was applied to these. But I don't know about you, but I grew up hearing that sharing did not involve a financial transaction. Robo, I think, is appropriate too, because we're talking here about robotics. And when engineers, as they sometimes do, but especially their employers, the companies, will often use the word autonomous in a way that I find inherently dishonest. Now, I get a lot of objection to this because engineers say we only mean autonomous in the engineering sense. But that word developed an engineering sense because people with something to sell wanted that word. It wasn't the accurate word because an autonomous thing has a mind of its own. And robotaxis, when they work their best, are the opposite of autonomous. They're doing exactly what they're programmed to do. And that's the opposite of autonomy. So I do think we have been subjected to a flood of misleading and sometimes dishonest vocabulary. And for that reason, I don't use autonomous to describe robo-taxis.
I want to pick up this thread about doing what they are programmed to do, because I think certainly in the bicycle community, there's a little bit of a divide. Some people are kind of adamantly against anything that basically results in more driving or more cars on the road. But then you have another contingent that argues, and I think it's fair, both sides arguing here. The other side arguing, well, we kind of live in a car-dominated place, and if these vehicles have a better safety record or aren't going to start road raging, isn't that better for my kind of personal safety? But given what we know about the history of the car industry on our streets, I'm wondering what's to say that these fleets will be safe until they are allowed everywhere, and then the companies dial back the safety meter. We've seen with Uber and Lyft that these services used to be really cheap. And then after, at least here in California, there were competing ballot measures about whether the drivers would be considered employees or independent contractors. And the independent contractor side went out, and yet the prices still jumped dramatically after this experience. So, what's to say this wouldn't happen with the safety angle on these robo-taxis?
Well, I really admire the questions that you're asking. They're exactly the right ones we should be asking. And we can't always judge where it's going from exactly where we are. So right now, we know, for example, that the cost of supplying a passenger with a robo-taxi ride is much greater than the fare the passenger pays. And this should alarm us because, first of all, it suggests that this technology is less cost effective than it appears to be, because cost efficacy is a function of cost. And if the cost is artificially low. We're not getting an accurate picture of cost efficacy. And then we also have to recognize that if a for-profit company is operating at a loss, there must be a for-profit plan along the way. And of course, the for-profit plan is you will lose money in order to become the number one competitor in the field. And then once you've become the number one competitor in the field and won out, then you can start to charge the price that the market will bear because the competition is gone. This is a very old pattern in capitalism. You know, this is how Standard Oil became number one. They sold their oil at a loss to undercut competitors until they rose to the top. And that works very well in certain industries where the costs of entry are very high, because once you've got leadership, you can't just have some random person come in and compete with you because it's so difficult to enter that particular line of work. I think it's very important also that we ask about these vehicles. Are we interested in whether they work or can be safe? Because if that's true, then we forget about questions like what's the best alternative among the alternatives before us. I mean, to give you an everyday example, in theory, I could rebuild my house so I could get around easily and get into every room on a Segway. But I'm not going to do it because I don't need to, and it's dumb, and it's very energy intensive and or technology intensive, and requires a lot of adaptation. Often when we talk about robotaxis or other robotic vehicles, self-driving vehicles, we hear questions like, when will they be safe enough? As if that's the only question. It turns out, of course, there's other ways that we should be comparing so that we choose the right path and not merely asking what it will take. And when the comparison is made at all, it's usually the worst possible comparison, namely, are they better than a human-driven car? Which is the wrong question, of course, because we have also the possibility of a future where you don't have to drive your own car and you don't have to get a robotaxi. And that's not an imaginary future. That's every day in the Netherlands or in Copenhagen or in some other places, Paris.
Very well put. I could ask you about this all day, but I'll ask one more pertaining to this topic in your article. There's the warning, or I don't know if you want to call it the warning, but there's this crossroads right before Canada, and you know, we're in the thick of it here in the US. The robotaxi industry has a lot of money on their side. Do you see them prevailing on the basis of that, or do you see them failing based on what we know and what you described about the sheer space they occupy, and that no amount of technology can account for that space deficit and the unpredictable nature of humans who aren't inside the robotaxis?
So that's the right question. The answer is somewhat difficult, but I would say that we are not yet at a place where we're asking the right questions. And the right questions aren't, will robotic cars be safe and effective enough to serve our purposes? That's not the right question. The right question is, given the alternatives before us, which ones are worth pursuing? Which ones are the most cost-effective, the most sustainable, the most accessible, affordable, consistent with health and safety, and which ones don't belong on that menu? Now, it can be a long menu. It can include passenger cars, for example. But if you just ask a question like, can robotaxis be good enough, then you put all of your energy into pursuing that goal at the expense of the other goals. There's a really good lessons to be learned from practical problem solvers. Take, for example, a carpenter. You don't tell a carpenter, look, you're now going to solve all of your problems with your screwdriver and you get rid of all of your other tools. The carpenter will say, I don't have a favorite tool. I use the right tool for the job, and that's why I need a tool kit. Don't tell me you're going to make my screwdriver so high tech that it will somehow drive nails as good as a hammer. I have a hammer for that. Same is true in a city. Don't tell me your robo-taxis are going to be so good that I don't have to ride a streetcar or a bus, because for certain purposes, a streetcar or a bus is going to be the better way to get there. especially when we take cost into account as well as spatial efficiency. So we need to be clear. There's a great example coming straight out of the ancient Greeks. When you look at the Platonic dialogues, they begin with, let's define our terms here. And we need to define our terms here. And the first term to define is, what is good, practical, everyday mobility?
Yeah, I said you're one of the most thought-provoking people in this field, and I think this is just validating that. I wanted to ask you about the streets in the US during the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic. A lot of cities adopted so-called slow streets, which essentially gave pedestrians permission to walk in the roadway so that they could give space from other people, so that they could exercise and not be in kind of enclosed spaces. I volunteered to maintain one of these slow streets in my neighborhood. And what this means is that I ended up biking several streets 3 times a day, in the morning, afternoon, and in the evening, to make sure that the signage was properly set up. So I got to see these slow streets from basically day one in my neighborhood. During the whole peak, I saw more people walking and biking on these slow streets than I have ever seen since on the major streets where we have painted bike lanes. The turnout was kind of remarkable. I remember one experience when I was kind of patrolling the slow streets to make sure all the signage was properly set up and hadn't been knocked over. I saw people walking 3 abreast in the middle of the roadway, middle-aged people. One of them had a dog, and a car driver was approaching from behind and was overtaking, slowly, admittedly. But one of the pedestrians was very upset and, shouted something, shook their fist, and they were indignant about this. And to me, having read your book, seeing this, to me, it almost seems like I was experiencing what the streets were like in the early 1900s as the cars were slowly making their way onto our roadways. And I wanted to know, did you have a chance to see any of these slow streets firsthand? And did you see any of these parallels?
Yes, I did. I recall in particular the way restaurants extended their tables outdoors, often into where curb parking had been. I saw this in Washington, D.C. in particular. And I did entertain the thought or hope that we were seeing some possible trend here toward a recovery to some extent of our original definition of the street, which is a place for everybody, and where the place where the people who cause the least danger to others, namely pedestrians, are welcome. Of course, it really didn't play out that way, and once the pandemic subsided, we saw a rapid return to the pre-pandemic norm. So it was disappointing. But yes, I did see something like what you saw, although I have to say the care you took, Severin, to, observe these streets and make sure that they were still welcoming places. I really admire that. That's what we needed.
It really was interesting because it seemed like for 3 months we had a new normal, but here in Los Angeles, the program started in April, and by July and certainly by August, the bicycle and pedestrian traffic had almost completely disappeared, and you would never known that it had been there during that time.
We've got decades of momentum against us.
Yeah. The history books will look back and see that there was a glimmer of hope there. I wanted to ask you, when kids were taught to stay out of the road, it could be seen as self-preservation, even if parents didn't agree with changing what had been done for years prior. So I'm not referring back to 100 plus years ago when streets were more friendly and accommodating to pedestrians. Despite what we just discussed about during this brief period in the early days of COVID, where people felt like they had permission to be in the roadway, if we want to reverse, do we need to do things on a piecemeal basis? Because the shift has been so dramatic, what do you see being the path to going back to what we once had?
I think we have a lot to learn from the people who succeeded at transforming the status quo a century ago. They're one of the proponents of car domination way back in 1922, wrote an editorial in which he said, "The obvious solution lies only in a radical revision of our conception of what a city street is for." It was a genius statement. It was a very ambitious vision. And pursuing that ambitious vision was not easy, but they did it very smartly. And you mentioned, changing laws alone can look reckless or doomed to failure. They had that same problem. They knew they couldn't just say outlaw walking and expect people to obey. So they approached the problem from those three angles simultaneously, and that is laws, social norms, and engineering standards. And then for each one of them, it was complex as well. So you don't just change the written law, you also have to change the behavior such that following the law is approved and not following the law is disapproved. And people learn this. And this includes things like getting to children young. Besides attacking all three fronts at the same time in small steps each so that they advance together, it's also important to give people an attractive and conceivable and imaginable vision of the future that makes it worth this change. Motordom, the people who sold us car dependency, were brilliant at giving us vivid, attractive visions of a future where you drive everywhere for everything and it works. These were unrealistic visions. They were practically impossible visions, but they were attractive and absorbing visions, and they were promoted extremely effectively. Well, we need the same, and we're doing the same. I love what Clarence Eckerson of Street Film does. He shows you films of places like Utrecht, for example, where people get along every day for everything on bikes primarily, but also on foot and by transit. And those are vivid, attractive visions, such that the most viewed videos that Clarence Eckerson has on street films are such visions. That's what we need. It doesn't guarantee success, but it's necessary to success. Small experiments can make a big difference too, because people are understandably uneasy when you say, well, you're not going to be allowed to drive on this street anymore. What you can do instead that works much better is short, temporary, reversible treatments that let people experience a people-friendly street. And then if they like the experiment, then it can become something more permanent. This was the success behind many of New York's changes over the last 20 years. And there's some, to some extent, in Los Angeles as well. So there are no guaranteed paths, but we do have examples. We have examples of very rapid change in Paris, which, people will say that lesson doesn't apply well to the US context. Well, I think it applies better than people say, but we can even then simply recognize that there are things we can learn from them, then adapt to our context here. So there are things we can do and things that are being done. And even though state departments of transportation are usually not very helpful, local, municipal, city departments often are, including LA.dot to some degree.
Peter always has so many great things to say, and that was part one of Severin's interview. We'll have part two next week. Next up is Luke Hoffman, and Luke is the executive director of the Iowa Bicycle Coalition. And they're here because there was actually a bill in Iowa that was going to ban bicycle riding on almost every street in the state. And Luke's organization stepped up, and it looks like the bill has been shelved. But here's Luke to fill us in.
All right.
What the hell is going on in Iowa? Luke, welcome to Bike Talk.
Thank you so much for having me. Appreciate the opportunity to come talk about this.
Absolutely. What is HSB 637, the bicycle ban bill?
Yeah, we call it the most anti-biking bill in the history of the Iowa legislature. This bill, as you said, if enacted, would ban biking on most of Iowa's roadways. Any road that's over 25 miles per hour, which is almost all roads. It's
Right.
definitely all gravel roads, right, which tend to be 45 or 55. And it would also make it functionally impossible to be a bike commuter, which we know there are many bike commuters in Iowa, right? Because if you're only allowed to use roads that are over 25 miles per hour, well, you're not going to be able to get to your place of work by just using 25 mile per hour residential streets.
Right.
It does have an exception for bike lanes, but I bet you anything they're not going to build enough bike lanes to get someone from home to work or anywhere else between now and the time the bill could have potentially been enacted. So it is the most restrictive bill that we've ever seen come out of the legislature, including the one that inspired the Bike Coalition now 22 years ago to come into existence, which would have just flat banned all biking on all roads and would have made RAGBRAI impossible, just like this bill does. But then this bill does a number of other things, right? So it also would ban parcel delivery. So if you're a DoorDash or Uber Eats person, which I've had people deliver to me on a bike, say, hey, I'm on my bike, where's your apartment getting connected, right? So it would make that explicitly illegal, no parcel delivery. Can't tell you why that's a safety hazard.
Right.
And then, banning class 3 e-bikes. So it just has so many restrictions, and ostensibly it was to address that e-moto issue, which I think they were conflating e-bikes and e-motos there for sure. I think there's a lack of understanding and knowledge.
Right.
But I think really it was all under the guise of safety. And I think
it came out of the Public Safety Committee, correct?
Right. Ironically enough.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So we know that this bill has now been shelved, right? So it's been put, I was told, in the drawer, and we forgot which drawer it is now in.
Right.
That's how much uproar this thing caused. I see such an opportunity in this crisis because there is a conversation that's now happening even globally. I saw this hit GCN just the other day. And so they were talking about it. They said, and I quote, "This takes the biscuit." So you go watch that. It's pretty funny. They're talking about this with British accents, and they don't believe it.
Yeah, just so people know, GCN is the Global Cycling Network, and it's on the internet, and I guess it's on TV also. I'm not really sure. I don't watch it on TV, but yeah.
So it's made a big splash, right? But what I want folks to know is if we take a moment to pause and get past the justified kind of outrage, the very natural human response, which is to be extremely unhappy about this, which I know I was. But to say that, what is the opportunity here? Well, let's have this conversation. Why do bikes belong on the roads? And what is it about vulnerable road users that are worth protecting? And what things in safety can we find that we can collaborate on together? What common ground could be found to enhance safety? I'll note that Iowa is one of the 6 states in the country that doesn't have a safe passing law. That's a safety concern.
Right.
I'll note that in Iowa in 2023, there were 1,415 people who were convicted of going 100 miles per hour while speeding in a vehicle. That's a safety concern. Until this last year, we were, didn't have a hands-free law in place. We got that passed. That's now saving lives. Lowest number of traffic fatalities in 100 years. We addressed that safety concern. Those are all very real and very serious safety concerns, policies, solutions. But what is not a real concern is, bikes and scooters going and killing people in mass. That's not happening, right? To best of my knowledge, 0 people have died because of getting hit by a bike. Not to minimize that there is safety concerns with people who are maybe behaving improperly or not following the cultural norm, staying on your left, things like that. That's happening. But I think it's about how we address the issue. And I would just summarize it by saying this bill uses a chainsaw where a scalpel is better.
Right.
And the other thing that it did is it had a one-size-fits-all definition. So it wasn't just about e-bikes or bikes. It applied to any bike or wheelchair, scooter, skateboard, or any kind of what they call personal conveyance. That's the legal term that is used to just say any kind of wheeled device at all.
Yeah, I think that's the word they use in the bill is device, which I think is such a funny, choice of words.
Yeah.
Earlier you mentioned RAGBRAI. I'm not sure everyone knows what that is, but that's the Registrar's Annual Great Bike Ride Across Iowa. And it's I've never done it, and I would love to come to Iowa and do it one year, but it's a ride that attracts 30,000 people from all over the country and maybe even all over the world to ride from border to border. And this bill would also outlaw those kinds of things. And from my understanding, RAGBRAI brings a lot of economic vitality to some of the smaller towns across Iowa and is really supported by the population of Iowa.
That's right. Yeah. So RAGBRAI is the world's oldest, longest bike ride. It's technically a bike parade, of course. And so there is some vague exemption for bike parades, but it doesn't have procedurally how to get that exemption applied. And so it does also talk about getting a permit for any bike that touches a road where it's, not supposed to be there according to that bill. So does that mean that every single road RAGBRAI uses, you'd have to get an individual permit for that road, which would make it functionally impossible to do that. Right. So in our opinion, this bill would ban RAGBRAI. Right. And that would be a disgrace, I think. Here's the thing. We did a study, the Bike Coalition did a study that was released this past January ago, so about a year ago. And it showed that the economic impact of just recreational bicycling in Iowa is $1.4 billion with a B year over year. We would be shooting ourselves in both feet by passing this bill. And I have to say, whether you're a cyclist or whether you're a driver or you're a cyclist who's driving to a trailhead,
sure,
if the roadway is safer, we're all going to benefit from that.
Well, Luke Hoffman of the Iowa Bike Coalition, thanks a lot for staying on top of things like HSB 637 and getting that off the radar. What does Kevin Costner say in the movie? Is this heaven? No, it's not heaven. It's Iowa or something like that.
That's right. The Field of Dreams. So,
Field of Dreams.
Yeah, that's how I feel about the trails. It is a field of dreams. That's what is keeping me around here. That's for sure.
Great. Well, Luke, thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Appreciate the opportunity to have the conversation.
That was Luke Hoffman, the executive director of the Iowa Bicycle Coalition.
Crazy bike-lash.
Crazy bike-lash. And, biking brings in a lot of money to Iowa. We talked about it in the interview with RAGBRAI, but luckily it seems like that bill is dead in the water. So thanks, Luke.
All right. Good show.
Yeah. Our work here once again, Nick.
And work is done.
We want to thank our guests, Michael Schneider, Jim Pokras, Tiffany Cogell, Zohran Martinez, Peter Norton, and Luke Hoffman. And of course, we always want to thank our regulars, Julie Richard, Kevin Burton, Charlie Lighthizer, Amy Ziering, Lindsay Sturman, Stacy Randecker, and Josh Haglund.
And the quote?
I found a really good quote that I think is apropos. Bikes bring you places cars never see.
That's right. Thanks, Taylor.
Ride safe.
This episode of Bike Talk is sponsored by the law offices of Pokras and De Los Reyes, with offices in Los Angeles and Bakersfield, and serving all of Southern California.
Bike Talk is a project of CRSP and the Los Angeles Eco-Village Institute. And that was Bike Talk. If you have a story, a tip, or a topic, head over to biketalk.org and send us a message. Talk again next week.
Get that car out of my way. I want to ride my bike today. Keep it fit, get me there. I won't go stinking up the air. Leave behind a daily grind. Let your mind unwind. If it's life, pretend to life. Better get yourself a bike.
Oh, got yourself a bike. Oh, got yourself a bike. Oh, got yourself a bike.